Hi, my name's Benedict for High Hertz. In this episode, we're looking at Dext. Dext is, well, it's been around for some time and it's commonly about the first name that comes up when people ask for free synths with lots of patches, or if they dare, the dreaded FM term. Now, that's a pretty fair achievement. Dext was primarily, as far as I can understand, and it makes sense, designed to be a librarian and a way to play back Yamaha DX7 patches in the DAW environment. My understanding is it was never really designed to be a programmable synth. Someone came up with the idea of like, oh, well, we could program it from here, and there was an interface put on it, and good on them. But the problem with Dext, like a lot of FM, is that it's incredibly hard to program. One of the issues is that while the DX7 wasn't real easy to program with its little LCD, the program was set up to work that way, and it did work. I had a DX100, which was a cut-down version of the 7, and people bitched and said, oh, they're unprogrammable and what have you. My opinion is no, that was not true. They were not super easy to program. They weren't as easy to program as a Juno 106, but the thing was programmable. To be fair, I came from having a Casio CZ, which was an attempt to, hold the market against this DX7. So that was Casio's take on FM synthesis. They call it phase distortion, which is actually more literally accurate. Technically, Yamaha's FM is actually phase distortion. But let's not let the truth get in the way of anything. That never pleased anyone. The DX7 was hard because this has the priority of being able to load real DX7 sounds. So you can take a cartridge, and as long as you can get those sounds off that cartridge into a floppy disk or into your computer, this can load them. They can be translated, which means that this has to really match as much as possible one for one what the DX7 did. And it was designed for a very different interface from this. And our expectations from this are going to be different from what they were with the little LCD. So bottom line, this is a nightmare to program. It will always be a nightmare to program. You can get used to it, and you can teach yourself to say how great it is, because the engine is great, but the interface is, well, it's wrist-slashingly horrid. But to be very, very fair, there are very few FM synthesizers, even in this modern DAW world, that have really cracked making FM easy. And the second part of this, I will try to ease that a little bit, because if you're going to go down this road, it's unprogrammable until you understand how FM works, let alone how this works. So we'll help you with a little bit. As far as I am aware, and some people might want to scream about this, while FM8 is a highly programmable synth, and there are a few clones of that. I made one of my own called Glaz, which if you look around you can find. It's a simpler version, but it's essentially the same logic of that, of using a matrix rather than these algorithms. But Algorithm from Reason Studios is probably hands down the very best interface for programming FM, but I'm going to show you in a slightly cut down way how to start to get in. Most people will approach this as a preset instrument, and there are a lot of sounds available before you get into anywhere else. So we've got lots of presets. And they will tend to be relatively random. Exactly where all these sounds are from, I'm not sure. They may be the 100 sounds that came stock on a DX7. I haven't found the helicopter. I think that was towards the end. Can't see it, doesn't really matter, but the helicopter was famous. I don't think this is it, but there was a pan flute sound which was very famous. That's close. To understand these, this is modern, that wouldn't have been. So these maybe are sounds that have been made or put in from text. But if you go out on the internet, you can actually find, and I think they help you find, thousands of sounds which have come from people's DX7s, and you can load them into this machine. And the DX7 got famous for its tremendous ability to be very detailed in sound programming, which you will hear across some of these sounds. There's a certain tone or timbre that's very distinctive to the DX7, which you will love or hate. But it works tremendously in mixes when you know how to manage it. So, massive range of presets, but don't come in expecting any of the real DX7 patches to be Insta Armin van Buuren. They are not wubby sounds. While FM is capable of getting to the wub wub wacka wacka kind of arena, this instrument is not the best way of doing it. You probably need to look at one of the alternates. Or if you're not prepared to spend money on a synth and really dig in, then get Vital and dig into that, because that's designed to do the wub wub wacka 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 kind of thing. I say that because I hear a lot of people talking about FM as though it's only designed to do wub wub wacka wacka kind of sounds. No, they were actually designed to emulate at a far greater level of detail real world sounds. And while Moog synthesizers were often sold under, ooh, look, here's a farty noise, that's a string, here's the same farty noise, that's a trumpet, here's the same farty noise, and that's a glockenspiel, obviously we never fully fell for that. We realized they were an instrument on their own right. Digital synthesis had been around. Yamaha put a version of this structure into an instrument way before this, but it was more in the home church professional arena than in the rock band professional arena. It was expensive. This didn't take off, and most people weren't really aware of digital synthesis, even though they were hearing it all over records with like Ned Synclavier, which was actually a license of this, Fairlights, PPGs, and the wave terms, which were starting to get into samples. Just people were like, how on earth do we use this thing? You know, they would hire somebody to use it, just as people hired somebody to use a DX7. You know, you'd see on a record an actual credit for the DX7 person because they were hard. But suddenly this instrument that was completely unaffordable came out was affordable. And it was much better value for money for the gigging musician to buy a DX7 that had 100 sounds and it could play twice the number of notes at once. And they could flip through from, oh, here's a guitar, here's a Hammond organ, here's another Hammond organ, here's a Wurlitzer, here's a Rhodes, here's a string, here's a clarinet, here's a saxophone. And while none of these things really sounded quite right, the pianos sounded gorgeous, but they were unique. The thing was, if you learned to play them, you could go an awful long way towards making something amazing out of them. So brass and all kinds of things came out of these DX7s in ways that we just couldn't do elsewhere. And suddenly there was this digital revolution. It was like, ooh, synthesizers can be digital, and they were far more clear and clean. And clean is a thing that finally record producers were going for. Right, wrong, good, bad, doesn't matter. It was the thing in the market because the technology had come so high that we weren't limited by analog just being muddy. Analog could sparkle, and analog did sparkle at that time as we had more and more digital control come into it. So this instrument came along and just created an overnight revolution. It didn't kill analog. Roland kept analog going very, very well, often by using analog to emulate digital. But nonetheless, digital was here and it was going to stay. And this is the instrument that kind of controlled the world until Roland fired back with the D50, which was a digital synthesizer with some samples built into it, but didn't FM. So it's the ubiquity that made the DX7 important. To get your hands on this, you will find lots of places that advertise that you can get this and download from them. Please be very careful. Some of those are dirty downloads. They will come with malware. You don't want to do that. So if you're a KVR user, start at KVR. Otherwise, go to their GitHub. So generally when you Google, you'll find free this, that, and the other, and some of those sites are genuine and not a problem, but a lot of them will, because they know that lots of, well, people who don't rightly know what they're doing will download this stuff and download extra things. Go to GitHub and get it from there. So it's a multi-platform, multi-format plug-in synth that's closely modeled on the Yamaha DX7, the MIDI cartridge librarian / manager. So the ability for you to take your DX7 sounds and put them up and play them back in the DAW environment. The ability to program is technically all there, but it's not going to be comfortable. Good and bad. The instrument Dext does exactly what it says it's going to do, as well as, if not better than probably anyone else who's doing the DX7 librarian. You know, grab any DX7 sound you can get onto your computer and have it replicated here with a pretty good degree of accuracy. So number one, it absolutely wins there. It sounds probably more DX7y than most of the DX7 clones. Oh, Arturia have one, of course, but I'm never really a fan of the Arturia clones. They're nice, but they always sound the same. They always sound like Arturia synths, not like the original, and they can't help but meddle with them, and that takes away from what made the synth in the first place. So I think if it goes head to head, I think we could fairly say that Dext is probably more brutally accurate than the Arturia instrument. If you like the Arturia instrument, I'm not telling you that you suck, so no need to be upset. It's just this was a librarian, so if we're comparing on that sense, I think Dext is probably more brutally accurate, including the downsides of the sound of a DX7, because they didn't sound the best. They were a cheapish digital analog converter, which was part of the charm of their sound, but it also made them sound less smooth, more digital. If you wanted nice when you were going into record, if you had a serious budget, then you tried to get yourself into a studio that had a DX1, because the DX1 was actually a pair of DX7s in a box with really nice converters and a bigger programming surface, so they were easier to program. There were only 150 of them, but most, if not all, of those were owned by serious studios or bands. I think OMD's DX1 just got a little bit of a tidy up. I think that's back in the world and working again. So the sound from this, I think, is as good as you can get if you're wanting to emulate a DX7. Does it sound good? Well, it sounds as good as a DX7, which means that if you don't process it nicely, if you aren't kind to it, it sounds horrid. But that's not the fault of Dext, because Dext is delivering exactly what a DX7 did do as closely as they can. There are a couple of other engine options. If we dig into parameters, we can go through Mark 1, the OPL, which I think is still a work in progress, and modern. Can you immediately hear the difference? Not necessarily, but they default to Mark 1 because that is the DX7 sound. So it sounds good in its own way, and that's great. The access to a ton of patches is attractive, obviously, to anybody who has or had or wants DX7 patches. So, I think it's probably the most accurate. So there's tons and tons of sounds out there some of which are very famous or infamous from having been used all over records. Good, bad, up to you. And its price point, of course, is somewhere in the unbeatable because it's free, but understand that there is a cost with this. It has a very large bad looming over itself, or right on its face, in that it is 99/100% unprogrammable. Yes, everything is there. Technically, it's as programmable as you could want or need it to be, but good luck getting anywhere without wanting to slash your wrists. A lot of that is down to the fact that they've had to model or stay as close as possible to the real DX7 architecture, obviously, so DX patches load. Otherwise, it will be a bit pointless. For programmability, yes, you can train yourself to do it, but if you're wanting to really program a DX7 from the ground up, which is where the real wonderful magic lies, then algorithm is going to be the easiest place to start. Otherwise, look at other options. But if you look at the Arturia thinking, I'm going to get a DX7 sound, make your own peace with that. DX7 is in part a result of its shocking limits. So the downside here is that once you move past loading patches, it gets challenging. Now, in the second half of this program, I'm actually going to show you how FM works. It's intriguing and incredibly powerful. There are things you can do with FM that you just can't do with other forms of synthesis, even other forms of digital synthesis. Often where they're saying, oh, we'll give you this FM kind of thing, they've commonly corralled you down to one thing. We're actually going to pop this aside for the moment and get into how FM works. Here is one I prepared earlier. This is something that I built because I couldn't make my peace with working this. I can program it, but I don't want to, and that's the problem. You will see in the center here, you've got this algorithm thing. And the way that works is central to how FM works. In FM language, we don't call these oscillators. They're called operators. What they do is they operate upon each other. So there's a carrier and a modulator. The carrier being, well, that's the thing that sits in the center, and then the modulator, which does stuff to it. It operates on it. It exerts pressure on it. So one of the first things that you see is picture of a sine wave, and then picture of a doubled up wiggly sine wave, because we've got another oscillator, an operator, a modulator, modulating, they say the frequency, but it's really the phase of that sine wave to make it go all kinds of wobbly. And in theory, we can make any waveform that we want. In practice, no, you can't. It'll always sound like FM. But that's where it gets both fascinating and infuriating. The algorithm thing defines what is exerting pressure on what is actually going out the front gate, and what is not. And that's fascinating, but bloody awful. Just really, really gruesome. It made sense in the DX7 with this much programmability in the window. It made perfect sense. But bear in mind, people were slower with how they programmed, or they plain didn't program a thing. Once we move out into this kind of structure, FM makes a completely different kind of sense. And while I understand this, and it's absolutely necessary for DX7 patches, it no longer serves a great purpose. You can use it and you can get there. But for the moment, let's step aside. So here, we're going to look through the very basics of how this works. We start out with a sine wave. It is possible, and more modern instruments will start out with different waveforms, but the whole essence of FM is to build whatever waveform, whatever timbre you want from nothing but sine waves. 4 will give you a lot of freedom, 3 will achieve a lot, 6 is, you can do almost anything. I don't know whether anybody's gone past 6, it would get but the thing is, you can get into more and more complex things. So we start with this one, down the bottom. So this works in a cascade. We're going to ignore this one because we're not going to use it. We could, but we're just going to work on 3 operators for the moment. It gives you the essence of how FM works. Pure sound, not very interesting. Now, what we need is to operate on that, to modulate that, to cause it stress. So we take our second oscillator, our second operator, and rather than routing its output to the output, see this is our output path here, this is saying the output of this oscillator / operator will go to the input of this one here. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4. Because this is routed the way that it is, some people like to work the other way around, so they could set their whole thing so that this was 1, that was 2, that was 3, that was 4. But top down to me makes sense, and it matches the algorithm here in the sense that 2 is operating on 1, 1 is outputting. 5 is operating on 4, which is operating on 3, which is outputting. So that's the logic behind that. Important to get your head around this because operators aren't the same as oscillators. While they are oscillators, they operate upon what the oscillator we're going to hear is. We can choose to hear an oscillator as it's working as an operator, but that's where we have to make our decisions. So our algorithm here at the moment is just 1 going out. That's it. If we bring in 2, 2 is not going to the output, but it's going to the FM input of 1. And here as we raise this, the signal coming out gets a lot more complex. Now, I'll be honest, this little synth of mine, it is FM, but it's not exactly the same sound as a DX7. The math is a little different, but the concept is exactly the same, even if the sound is slightly different. And a lot of FM synths meddle with the sound to make it smoother, easier, more pleasing, or more wub-wub-wubbery. So we can increase our level of this operator to make a more complex waveform. In other words, we are opening a filter. So rather than filtering out the overtones, we're actually adding them. FM is a form of additive synthesis. I know some people get bent out of shape about that, but we build by adding, not by subtracting. In analog, we say, let's get the fartiest oscillator that we can, and then use our filter to shave off the overtones that we don't want, subtracting things to get the tone we do want. Here, we start with a tone that, well, isn't very exciting, and then we add through the joys of math. But you don't need to know anything about math to do this. So, somewhere in there, in theory, there is a sawtooth. In theory. There then becomes the relationship. So if we look up here, you'll see there's this weird mathematical formula. That's the relationship, the tuning of this operator with regards to another operator. So in this case, it's assumed that everything is the note that you're playing, is the fundamental tuning. That makes perfect sense. And then we can move. And the relationship between 2 operators in pitch defines the waves that we built. So this operator 2 is an octave below operator 1. So it gives us a bassy kind of sound with a rougher kind of thing. We can go even lower than that, although this instrument doesn't allow that, but actually we can. I forgot that. We can use that too. And that becomes an LFO. One octave up. So our First operator is playing the note we anticipate. The second one is actually oscillating an octave higher, and guess what? That's a square wave. And as we go brighter and brighter, it turns into a pulse. Control of your waveforms is not the same, but ultimately can be a lot more detailed. But that's your basic forms, and then into pulses and all kinds of things. I've got quite a bit of oversampling happening here because without, there's a lot of Nyquistian action, which sounds awful. No doubt DX7s did it, but I haven't played a DX7 for forever, so I really don't remember what kind of Nyquistian action they get when you play the upper keys. I know the CZ was, it could get a bit interesting very, very early. Anything above sort of C4 could start to, if you're playing bright or high sounds, could start to get very gnarly. But that was the charm of the instruments. You learned to deal with it and live with it. Plenty of records went out there with bounce back on them. That's our basic tone. Now we can bring in the third operator. This third operator is not going to the output. It's operating upon, it's exerting its influence, it's modulating oscillator 2. So if we turn operator 2 down, nothing appears to happen. Let's bring that back up. And that gets really fast. And this is where FM becomes incredibly detailed, because we go, okay, I can get very controlled in the tone that I want. Analog, there's a fair amount we can do to create the raw waves that we want, way past the basic knob that switches between this form and that form. And that's what the whole Moog Modular thing was about. It was far more about building oscillator tones than it was about building filters. The obsession with filters came in with Acid House, really, and people forgot that the oscillator was what was really driving that little ship. FM reminded us that it was really about oscillators, in part because there was no filter. There has been a filter shoehorned into this, but yeah, whatever. It's for the weak. You create your forms here. So if we wanted our form to move, then we would simply use the envelope. So how that works over time. So that allows us to emulate the filter sweep. That's your basics. Once we bring in the third one, here how we can put that little chip on the front. Now that's hard to do with that kind of pin sharpness. You just can't do that. Particularly you couldn't do that in pre-DCO analogs. You could have a good go and you'd get something like it, but it wouldn't be as pin sharp as that. Especially if we were to that big blaze of noise. And let's allow that to fade because that's not very... So that's how we build up complex tones. And with envelopes, and the DX7 has more complex envelopes than these, as you will see, then we can actually make really quite interesting pad sounds. There is another thing that FM does, and that is called feedback. Feedback here doesn't work quite the same, but it gives you the concept. So if we turn off that, we're back to our sine wave. We can ask an operator to operate upon itself. And in many ways, we get a more accurate, to a certain extent, sawtooth through this. Not so much on mine, because mine has a technical limitation, but so often what we would do to get a classic electric piano sound because that's a little static, we could then add velocity. We can add velocity to the whole thing, or we can say, let's add velocity across each of those operators. And we end up with quite detailed sounds. So remember, FM is not like analog. Analog is subtractive. You start with the biggest, fartiest noise that you can that vaguely resembles what you're looking for. And you then use your filter to hack away at the bits that you don't want until ultimately you sort of go, oh yeah, it's close enough. And you live with it. That's when you're trying to emulate real instruments. But analog's a beautiful form. It really is, don't get me wrong. Then additive forms, and this is through math, not just saying I'll raise that particular partial at this particular time. That's pure additive, but this is additive, is where you start with the most basic of building blocks, and then you say, at this point in time, I want to add more of this and then more of that. And so you envelope these operators over time to create really, really beautiful and detailed sounds that work tremendously as electric piano, clavinet type things. Pads can be absolutely gorgeous, but they take time to program. You can do super brass because it allows you to put more detail into the beginning of it, the little farty noises and the vibration of the tin. So you can do really nice things, but it's all about how each operator exerts itself upon each other one, and then choosing which operators you can hear directly, as in going to the outputs, and which are only there to operate upon something else. At the moment, number 3 is operating on number 2, which is operating on number 1. We could remove that and have it operate directly onto number 1. Hear how that gives us a different sound. And And of course we can then just take all of those sounds, extend our envelopes right out, and say, oh look, we've now got a pad. We might want to soften some of those. But that is the essence of how FM works. In practical terms, it gets a little more complex, but that's all FM does. So if we look here, let's initialize a patch. Oh, better when I press that. Initialized patch. It's back to our boring sine wave. So now we've got to look at our algorithm and go, well, how do I want to output this? And that's one of the tricky things, because we sort of need to decide in advance what I want to do. Okay, let's take 3 operating on 2 operating on 1, which is going out the keyboard. We've also got 6, which has the option to feedback, operating on 5, operating on 4, which is going out the keyboard. So for the moment, let's turn these off. That's one advantage. A screen allows us to know that they are no longer there. So number 2, this is operating on. Hear how that's a little kinder. Now, like a lot of early digital synths, Dext really only gives you what your controls are doing when you re-trigger a note. So you can hear yourself getting strange results or even no result when you hold the knob down, or hold a key down and move a knob. It's kind of annoying, but this is the way those instruments worked. There were several instruments that I had back in that time where if you made changes in real time, you had to let go of the note and re-trigger it to actually get it to be able to do its math. Poor thing was thinking faster than it could. So there's our tone. Now obviously that's a lot better, a lot more able to output all these overtones. There's probably oversampling in here. I have no idea what it is, how it works, don't much care. We then get to the enveloping thing. Okay, that's just creepy. It's not the same. It works backwards. There is a logic to it, but it works backwards, which is just brain-breaking. The way that it works is this is the time and this is the level it's going to reach at that time. This is the time and this is the level it's going to reach at the end of that time. The same and then the same. So this one, you can see instantly it's going to full. It's not really making any changes. And then at the end, it's instantly going to not full, to off. So let's envelope here. And let's pull that down. And let's pull that down. See here, moving this will cause the note to glitch or not work right. So now we've got an envelope shape. Fair enough. We might give ourselves a little bit of release. Now we've got to at least match that here. Otherwise you can hear that overtone just drops out. But it requires some effort to actually work out how to get this right. The double stage there means that you can get interesting. So we could go like this. Let's just speed. You can hear the bounce back. So we've put a little echo or a delay in there. There's already an echo on this because listening to FM sounds dry is not fun. So now we've got clearly nicer than my instrument. The engine in here is really, really nice. We've got that at 26, which is possibly a little excessive. And there's only one way to get this kind of sound, and Believe me, this is the way. I'm yet to find another instrument that sounds as good as this. So now we take, let's just lower this and add in, which is operating on oscillator 2. We're not hearing this one, it's just operating on, it's exerting its pressure on this one. Let's just give that. And we're going to want to give that some let's lower this down to 1. See, kind of pure there. Let's extend that and lower this. Wrong one. Just remove some of the DC blip on the front there. Yeah, that's giving us a piano kind of sound, but it's a little undetailed. That's giving us a little bright blip on the front. And if we detune that a little bit, or quite a lot, it gets all manner of interesting. That's sort of perfect and clean. And it becomes bell-like. So now we've got very nice bell. But if we're applying just a little bit, we get that sound to pull through. Key velocity, if we apply, we can put a little bit more level back on. Same thing as what I just showed you before. We've got 3 operating on 2, operating on 1, which is going out the keyboard. And then we can do the same here. We've got 4, 5, and 6. Now these are not operating on the 1, 2, 3 path at all. So we can actually turn 1 off and nothing's happening. So we need to add this here. We have just 4 and 1 playing together. Put a little bit of an attack on this one. See how much more effort's having to go into making a really pretty simple sound. If we detune that slightly, well, more than slightly. Got a chorusy sort of a sound. So now if we bring in our full operator chain, needs to be there. It takes some effort to really kind of get used to the envelopes in particular. Let's add in 5. Yeah, we're immediately getting a much nicer sound. So that's kind of like the difference between a single DX7 patch or a pair of them playing together in that DX1. You can hear noise, or at least I can hear noise. It's quite common to get noise in FM, particularly the earlier versions of it, because the math was limited. So anytime they had to go, oh, that's beyond our ability to achieve right now, we'll just round that off. That was likely to give noise. And as the FM signal, the signal you're creating with FM gets more complex, it quickly turns into noise. So blasts of noise and Z80 computer game sounds, explosions and stuff like that. Yeah, FM. SID chip stuff. But what are we doing? We're needing to... And this is where it just becomes odious. Now that's a nice sound. You can definitely hear the FM-y thing happening. In theory, we need to turn all of these to +1, except for that one, because that was meant to be belly. And that gives us a pretty cool sound. Exactly what you're looking for, well, that's always kind of your thing. Let's get that back to... Just want the extra 1, which in theory should be doable. And then it's just about little subtle differences. And inside a mix, that's going to sound great. And it can sound great anywhere. It's not about genre, because the sounds flow so beautifully. Let's put some velocity scaling on this. I was just listening to something in the car on the way back this morning, and it had acoustic guitars, but they sounded like they were playing, like they were sustaining far longer than was normal. And I don't think really heavy sustainers were available, let alone would have likely been used on an acoustic guitar, because it would sound weird. And then I realised they were blocking the chords with an FM synth. So it gave these acoustic guitars the feeling like they just sustained. So they were able to use the guitars for what they were great at and not push them into what they were not great at, use the FM synths for what they were great at. And collectively, they got this really super sound that just kind of pushes the feel along inside that piece. So never think that these sorts of sounds are no good. They can be really useful inside a mix. And then, of course, you can get into uglier and uglier sounds, should you so desire. And put them through overdrives and all manner of things like that. It is a very time-consuming method of synthesis. If you can get comfortable using that interface, good on you. I just, while I'm happy to spend hours programming a sound, I find this so unintuitive. But again, this is the nature of this instrument because it's designed to be a replica, a one-for-one mathematically of a DX7 as much as is possible. And it delivers that really, really well. But the problem is it takes what's already a bit of a painful thing to program and make it even more painful. It's basically a laboratory experiment. So again, if you're wanting to dig into the subtlety of FM and what you can do, I think Reason Studio's algorithm. You need to run Reason to get it and spend another $100. But if you're hellbent, that is really, really good. Their former, which is now no longer available, their PX7 was very well respected as a DX7 clone. There is Arturia's instrument. Just make your peace with how accurate you're going to be doing the DX7 thing, because in my opinion, Arturia's stuff always sounds like Arturia stuff. They are revisionists, which is fair enough. Their clients want revisionism. There is Native Instruments FMA, which is very long in the tooth now. Oh, and Fruity's Citrus, but I don't think you can buy any of Fruity's VST anymore. I think I just read somewhere that they've pulled them, and I just reviewed one of their VSTs, and it was explained why it was kind of weird to get. I think they've pulled them from the broader market. Why, I'm not sure. Maybe they just want to funnel everybody into buying Fruity, but whatever. But Citrus was similar to FM8, and there are various other things out there that put their own spin on the FM thing, including mine instruments, but I know mine are very, very limited in what they will deliver, and getting that tremendous pinched up clarity and really nasty noise out of them is really only doable in pure honesty through Dext. It'd just be nice if we had a better way to program it that matched sort of modern conventions. Then I'd be like, yeah, hands down, go for it. But I don't see any sign of them looking to do that. And I fully understand that, because their primary motivation was to be as close to a true DX7 as possible. So that's really my final words, is it's excellent at what it's designed to do, which is be a librarian and a way to take existing DX7 patches and push them through your DAW environment. Its accuracy to a DX7 is one of, if not the best. Its programming is definitely doable, but I think that this interface makes it less pleasing than it should be for anyone, but particularly in a modern environment. Maybe they would need to make a fork in their project, but it'd be kind of cool if someone else were to come along and say, let's take that and make it so that it's actually a joy to program, just as Reason Studios did with Algorithm. Now, how accurate Algorithm might be to a DX7, I don't know, but they've started again. But it is an absolute joy to program, and so much easier to get that result, so much faster than it is to do it here, where a lot of things are unintuitive. That's the big problem that I have with it, that it's just, it takes so long that I've probably lost interest in getting there. If you already have Reason, but are not looking to get Algorithm, I actually don't have it. I use Thor. There's a tremendous amount that you can do with a little bit of planning, and Thor, and it's got a couple of FM operators in there, and you can then mix and match their analog oscillators, their CZ, phase distortion oscillators, with some of the FM thing, and that's pretty charming. If there are any questions, not directly about Dext, please, because that's between you and them, but just about FM and how to make it work, because it is a brain breaker. It really is, but it doesn't have to be, so long as, rather than trying to rush in and do over-the-top crazy things, you really work from the basics of being able to go, okay, how can I add those couple of layers of timbre that we've got here in electric piano type sound and or a pad type sound. Just work on those 3 layers of I've got my sine wave, I've got my first layer of timbral alteration, my second layer of timbral alteration. Once you get that concept, it becomes easier. But ask away. Once I'm aware of the question, then I'll pop over and answer it. Please, if you're asking questions or enjoying this, make sure you hit subscribe because it helps YouTube to know that we are valued just beyond your plays. Plus, we like to see it, and I really love when I see people, typing nice stuff in, engaging with us, because this is about people. Music's about people. Everything is about people. And just taking and never putting any of your people back in means that none of us are building. You're not building either. Like, you're not building relationships. I loved it in the earlier days of the internet. Relationships were really pretty easy to build. There were a few difficult people, but they didn't last long because they never did anything, so everybody ignored them or just slagged them off when they started doing the whole kind of stuff, basically being trolls. They would be named as a troll and they would disappear or be made to disappear. But creating relationships was great. I got my name on several records just for encouraging people to get their record done because they were sort of worrying about this or that, or they hadn't had the vision to think, hey, I could make a record out of this. And by my talking to them, then it was like, oh, okay, and we talk about it, and I'd give them advice, and they'd go out there, and next thing they knew, they had a record that they didn't realize that they had in them. And thanks to Benedict, those relationships were so good. And when you talk to people, like if you start talking down below and there's a relationship that gets developed, that opens doors. Freddie meets this guy called Brian May. There's a relationship. What happens? Queen. Build relationships. Talk. Allow that to happen. Because if you don't allow it to happen and you be all like, oh, but no, somebody may steal my idea, you'll never build anything. 4 pillars. I've mentioned this before, but 4 pillars of success. One of the first ones is to know what you're making, to have a clear sense of who you are, but then to build a backline. If you don't have a backline, pillar number 2, if it's not there, doesn't matter how much you think you're buying fans or how cool you think you are, with no backline, nothing can happen. Billy Idol's not Billy Idol. Billy Idol is Billy Idol plus Steve Stevens and the other guys in the band, including Mars Williams, and Keith Forsey, and his record company people, and whoever walks around with his spittoon and laces up his boots and paints on his angry smile. All of these things, these are all the Billy Idol machine, and necessary because a Billy Idol machine can't run without a backline. So build a backline by talking to people, and that can start here. You never know what's going to happen. You never know who you're going to meet until you start. Don't forget also higher hertz. I'm just going to give up. If I look, I can do it. This is why I can't play guitar. Higherhertz.com, different stream of information there, and of course you can get your sticky fingers on the Hertz delay, which is a freebie and beautiful. You've been hearing it here all along. Have a great day. That's what really matters.